The air inside the grand chamber of the High Synod tasted of ozone and terrified pheromones, a chemical cocktail of despair that no atmospheric scrubber could fully purge. Here, in the heart of the galactic Concordat's crowning architectural achievement, a crystalline station orbiting the twin blue giants of the Ethelgard system, the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that precedes the cracking of a planet's crust. High Counselor Valen, his chitinous plates dull and graying with age, gripped the edges of the obsidian podium until his talons threatened to fracture the stone. Above him, the holographic dome that usually displayed the harmonious trade routes and colonization manifests of 1,000 worlds now showed only an encroaching, cancerous red. The Crimson Scourge. It was not an army, it was a biological tide, a consuming hunger that had already silenced the outer rim sectors, leaving dead, husked worlds in its wake. There were no negotiations with the Scourge. There were no treaties. There was only consumption. And now the simulation showed the tendrils of this red death reaching for the core worlds, for Ethelgard itself. The grand chamber was filled with the representatives of 300 sentient species, yet the noise was minimal. It was the hush of the condemned. Valen looked out at the assembly, the gelatinous aquatic hydrari floating in their suspension tanks, their bioluminescence dimmed to a mournful indigo, the rock-skinned lithivores, usually so stoic, grinding their mandibles in a sound like tectonic shifting, the avian airy lords preening their feathers in nervous, jagged motions. They were the apex of civilization, the builders of the Dyson rings, the masters of zero-point energy, the poets of the nebulas. And they were going to die. They were going to be eaten alive by a mindless pathogen that utilized starships as spores and planets as incubators. Valen cleared his throat, a sound that echoed through the acoustic perfection of the chamber like a gavel striking a coffin. "The Ninth Fleet has fallen," Valen said, his voice amplified by the gravity weaves, reaching every ear and auditory receptor. He did not shout. The gravity of the statement required no volume. "Admiral Cathar, detonate the fusion cores of the flagship Light of Dawn in a final attempt to stem the tide at the Antares Gate." The explosion vaporized 3 moons and shattered the gate itself. Valen paused, letting the weight of the sacrifice settle before delivering the crushing blow. It slowed the Scourge by less than 6 standard hours. The bioships are reforming. They will be in the Ethelgard system within 2 rotations. A ripple of sound moved through the chamber, a low, discordant keen of mourning and panic. A hologram flickered to life in the center of the room, projected by the terrified AI that managed the station's defense grid. It showed the footage from the Light of Dawn's black box before the detonation. The image was grainy, distorted by the intense radiation of the Scourge's presence. It showed bioorganic vessels, massive hulks of flesh and metal fused together, latching onto the sleek silver hulls of the Concordat fleet. It showed the hull breaches, not by lasers or plasma, but by acids and boarding tentacles. It showed the crews not being killed, but being changed, their bodies twisted and repurposed into soldiers for the enemy. It was a horror beyond comprehension for a society that had known peace for 10,000 cycles. "We have no fleets left," the representative of the Hydrari bubbled, the translation software rendering their voice flat and mechanical. "We have no shields that can repel a biological solvent of that magnitude. We have exhausted every diplomatic avenue, every scientific countermeasure, every strategy in the archives of war. We are the ash before the wind." "There is one option," a voice cut through the despair. It was deep, resonant, coming from the shadowed alcove where the representative of the Kragari sat. The Kragari were a warrior race, or they had been before the Concordat domesticated them with trade and philosophy. General Gorth sat there, his 4 arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes burning with a desperate, heretical intensity. "One option we have refused to discuss because it offends our sensibilities. Because it frightens us more than the Scourge." Valen closed his eyes. He knew what Gorth was about to say. It was the forbidden topic, the shadowed region of the galaxy map, the exclusion zone. "General," Valen warned, his voice weary, "do not invoke them. We are desperate, not insane." "Are we?" Gorth stood up, towering over the nearby delegates. "We are facing extinction, total biological erasure, and you worry about the morality of unchaining the mad dogs. The Sol exclusion zone exists for a reason, yes. But the reason is that they are dangerous, and right now dangerous is what we need. We need monsters to... Monsters. They are not monsters," the Airy Lord representative twittered anxiously, fluffing her wings. "They are unstable, paradoxical. The humans of Sol are a Deathworld species, Class 5. They survived an evolutionary gauntlet that should have sterilized their planet. They breathe poison, they drink solvent, they thrive in gravity that crushes bone. But it is not their biology that scared the Concordat into isolating them. It is their psychology. They do not fight for territory or resources. They fight for concepts, for spite. They are capable of atrocities that make the scourge look like a natural disaster. And they are capable of kindness that defies logic, Gorth countered. They rebuilt the Cygnus sector after the supernova, did they not? Before the embargo, they saved the Velari from the plague. By burning the infected cities, Valen snapped, losing his composure for the first time. That is the human way, Gorth. They save the body by cutting off the limb. They do not understand nuance. They do not understand proportional response. If we send that SOS into the dark void of the exclusion zone, we are not inviting an ally. We are inviting a catastrophe to stop a tragedy. They will come with fire. They always do. Then let them burn it, Gorth roared, slamming a fist onto his console. Better to be singed by the fire than consumed by the rot. Look at the screens, High Counselor, look at them. The scourge does not kill, it assimilates. It takes your memories, your biology, your culture, and turns it into fuel for the hive. I would rather my people die by human plasma than become that. He pointed a trembling claw at the screen, where a feed showed a Concordat city being overrun, the citizens merging into a writhing wall of flesh. Chamber fell into a profound, terrifying silence. The logic was brutal, but it was undeniable. The fear of the scourge had finally eclipsed the ancient, deep-seated fear of the Terrans. The humans had been quarantined 3 centuries ago, not because they were weak, but because they were too strong, too volatile, too rapidly advancing. They had terrified the elder races with their chaotic duality, philosophers who built world crackers, healers who weaponized plagues, poets who wrote of genocide as a necessity. They were the variables the Concordat could not calculate, so they had locked them away behind a wall of treaties and orbital blockade buoys, leaving them to rot in their own gravity well. But the humans hadn't rotted, they had gone quiet. For 300 years, not a single transmission had left the Sol system. No ships came out, no trade was offered, just silence. A silence that felt like a predator holding its breath. If we send the signal, Valen whispered, and if they answer, what makes you think they will save us? We locked them in a cage, we treated them as pariahs. Because, Gorth said, his voice dropping to a rumble, humans have a concept they value above all others, above life, above logic, above survival. They call it debts. They believe we owe them nothing. But they also believe that the strong possess a duty to the weak. It is a biological imperative for them, born of their pack-bonding nature. They protect. Even if they hate us, they might protect us simply because we are screaming. Valen looked at the faces of the assembly. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw the resignation of the dying. The choice was no longer between life and death. It was between a death of soul and body or a chance at life bought with a deal with the devil. Activate the hypercoms, Valen ordered, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. Target the Sol relay, bypass the exclusion protocols. He looked up at the ceiling of the chamber as if he could see through the hull, through the light years to that yellow dwarf star and the blue marble that birthed nightmares. Send the SOS, standard Concordat distress frequency, encryption level 0, let them know. Let them know we are begging. The command was executed. A pulse of tachyonic energy, faster than light, punched a hole through the subspace medium. It carried a packet of data, the coordinates of the Ethelgard system, the nature of the threat, and a plea for assistance. It traveled across the spiral arms, past the nebulae, past the dead zones, until it hit the network of warning buoys surrounding the Sol system. Then there was waiting. Minutes stretched into hours. The scourge advanced. The outer defense platforms of Ethelgard went dark one by one, their screams cut short by static. The tension in the grand chamber became physical, a weight that pressed on the lungs. Had the signal been received? Were the humans dead? Had they destroyed themselves in some civil war, as the Concordat had always predicted? High Counselor, the communications officer, a tremor in his voice, spoke up. We have a response. On screen, Valen said, bracing himself. The main holographic dome SH. Ifted, the red of the scourge was replaced by a static field, gray and harsh. Then the static cleared. There was no image of a human face, no bridge of a starship, just a symbol, a stylized eagle clutching a lightning bolt and an olive branch, but the olive branch was burning. And there was text, scrolling in the stark, angular script of High Terran. Message received. Origin, Terran Republic High Command. Status, deployment authorized. ETA imminent. Advisory, evacuate orbital planes. Secure all and combatants. Do not interfere. That's it, the Hydrari representative asked. No negotiations, no questions about the enemy. They didn't ask what the enemy was, Gorth noted, a chill running down his spine. They didn't ask how many ships we needed, they just said, imminent. Sensor contact, the tactical officer screamed, the sound tearing through the room's decorum. High-energy spike, it's, by the gods, the readings are off the scale. It's not a warped translation, it's a tear in local space. Above the station, in the darkness of space where the red tide of the Scourge was assembling for its final push, reality screamed. It was not the elegant, silent shimmer of a Concordat warp drive. This was violence done to physics. A rupture opened, bleeding Cherenkov radiation, a wound in the universe that shone with the color of a bruised sun. From the wound they came. They did not look like ships. They looked like moving mountains, brutalist slabs of gray armor plate and gunmetal, scarred and pitted, lacking the smooth curves and aesthetic grace of galactic engineering. They were flying bricks, ugly and massive, bristling with antenna and weapon ports. There were no lights on their hulls, no decorative fins. They were tools, pure and simple, tools of war. One ship larger than the rest, a dreadnought that eclipsed the sun, its hull painted in matte black so that it looked like a hole in the starfield, positioned itself between the Scourge fleet and the planet Ethelgard. Scan them, Valen whispered. I want to know what we have invited. I can't, Counselor, the sensor officer stammered. Their active jamming is overwhelming our systems. I'm reading massive thermal buildups. They aren't powering shields. They're diverting all reactor output to weapons. Hail them, Valen commanded. Tell them the Scourge is biological. Tell them the victims are inside the bioships. They must use precision strikes. They must. Channel open, the officer said. A voice filled the grand chamber. It was not synthesized. It was human, rough, sounding like gravel grinding against steel. It carried a tone of absolute, terrifying calm. This is Admiral Stukov of the Terran Republic ship Indomitable, the voice said. We have received your distress call. We have analyzed the threat profile. We are initiating the Shiva protocol. Admiral, Valen shouted at the pickup. The enemy fleet contains millions of our citizens. They are hostages within the biostructure. You must disable them, not destroy them. We need surgical strikes. There was a pause on the line, a silence that lasted 3 heartbeats, heavy with judgment. High Counselor, Stukov's voice returned, devoid of emotion. You misunderstand the nature of the infection. There are no hostages. There is only the pathogen and the biomass it consumes. To save the patient, we must excise the tumor, all of it. No, the Hydrari representative wailed. You cannot. Stand down, Concordat vessels, Stukov ordered. Clear the line of fire. We are not here to negotiate the terms of your survival. We are here to ensure it. The link cut. On the holographic display, the Terran fleet began to move. They didn't adopt a defensive formation. They charged. They accelerated toward the Scourge fleet with suicidal speed, their engines flaring with dirty, radioactive exhaust. The Scourge, reacting to the new threat, swarmed. Thousands of bioships, tentacles lashing, acid spitters primed, rushed to meet the human blockades. They are going to be overwhelmed, Gorth muttered, though his eyes were wide with awe. They are flying straight into the maw. Then the Indomitable fired. It was not a laser. It was not a plasma bolt. It was a railgun slug the size of a shuttlecraft, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. It impacted the lead bio-Kraken of the Scourge fleet. There was no explosion, not in the traditional sense. The kinetic energy transfer was so immense that the bioship simply ceased to exist as solid matter. It turned into a cone of expanding plasma, a spear of light that pierced through the first ship, then the second behind it, then the third, shattering a line of enemies 10,000 kilometers long. Then the rest of the human fleet opened fire. The grand chamber shook as if the station itself had been hit. The sensors were blinded by the sheer output of thermal energy. The humans were using nuclear ordnance, shaped nuclear charges, flak cannons firing. Depleted uranium, coherent radiation beams that boiled the liquid of space. It was a storm of fire. They were not disabling engines. They were not targeting weapon systems. They were atomizing everything in their path. They are killing them all, Valen whispered, horror gripping his hearts. Our people, our captured crews. Look at the Scourge, Gorth said, pointing. Look. The Scourge, which had never known fear, which had never paused in its consumption, was recoiling. The biological hive mind was reacting to pain. The human onslaught was so violent, so total, that the enemy could not adapt. The bioships tried to regenerate, but the humans used incendiary rounds that clung to the vacuum-hardened flesh, burning with oxidizers that didn't need air. They turned space into a furnace. The battle, if it could be called that, it was more of an extermination, lasted less than an hour. The Scourge fleet, a force that had dismantled the Concordat's best armadas, was reduced to a drifting cloud of radioactive dust and charred meat. But the humans did not stop there. The Indomitable turned its prow toward the outer planet, a small, agri-world that had been the first to fall in the system. It was already covered in the red moss of the Scourge, a lost cause. "Admiral Stukov," Valen screamed into the comms, though he knew the channel was closed. "What are you doing? That planet is lost, but there may be survivors in bunkers." The dreadnought opened its ventral bays. Massive cylinders dropped, falling toward the planet's atmosphere. "Cyclonic torpedoes," Gorth recognized them from the old war tapes. "Atmosphere burners." "They are going to glass the planet," the Airy Lord shrieked. "They are monsters. We called for help and they brought the apocalypse." The cylinders hit the atmosphere. A moment later, the surface of the agri-world bloomed. It wasn't a mushroom cloud, it was a global firestorm. The atmosphere ignited. The red moss, the infected cities, the surface oceans, everything burned. The planet turned into a glowing ember in the dark. Silence returned to the Grand Chamber, a silence of absolute shock. The Scourge was gone, the immediate threat to Ethelgard was erased, but the cost was the total annihilation of everything the Scourge had touched. The comms crackled to life again. "Orbit secured," Admiral Stukov's voice said. "The infection vector has been neutralized. We are deploying ground teams to the main station to ensure no spores have breached your containment. Do not resist." You slaughtered them," Valen stammered, his voice trembling with rage and grief. "You killed the hostages, you burned a world." "We responded to an SOS, Stukov said. "You called for Deathworlders. Did you expect a scalpel, counselor? You dwell in a garden, we dwell in a graveyard. We know that when the rot sets in, you do not sing to it. You burn it out. We have bought you a future. Do not squander it with tears for the dead who are already gone." "Prepare for boarding," the Admiral added. "We need to talk." The arrival of the Terran delegation onto the Grand Conclave Station was nothing like the diplomatic processions of the past. There were no ceremonial robes, no exchange of gifts. The airlock cycled, and a squad of hulking figures in powered combat armor stepped through. The armor was scarred, painted in urban camouflage and grays, pistons hissing with every movement. They carried rifles that looked heavy enough to anchor a small ship. Their helmets were opaque, faceless visors that reflected the terrified faces of the alien guards. In the center of the formation walked Admiral Stukov. He wore a dress uniform, but it was severe, black with silver trim, high-collared, a single row of medals that clinked softly. He was an older human, his face lined with the stress of high-G maneuvers and hard decisions. A scar ran from his jaw to his temple, pale against his weathered skin. He carried no weapon, but his presence was lethal enough. He walked into the Grand Chamber, his boots ringing on the crystalline floor. The alien delegates shrank back. They looked at him not as a savior, but as a natural disaster that had taken human form. Valen stood at the podium, trying to muster the dignity of his office. "Admiral," he said, his voice icy, "you have saved us, and you have damned us. You have violated every convention of war established by this Concordat." Stukov stopped at the base of the podium. He looked up at the High Counselor, his expression unreadable. "Conventions of war are for wars between peers," Stukov said. His voice was not amplified, yet it carried. "For disputes over borders or resources, you are not fighting a war, Counselor. You are fighting an extinction event. You do not apply the Geneva Convention to a plague." "There were millions on those ships," Valen cried out. "Our kin, they were alive." "They were incubators," Stukov corrected him, harsh and immediate. "We scanned T. Their neural pathways were rewritten. Their biomass was being digested to fuel the next wave. They were in agony, Counselor. Every second they existed was a torture you cannot imagine. We gave them the only mercy left. We gave them silence." A murmur went through the crowd. The brutality of the statement was shocking, but the logic, the cold, hard, Deathworld logic, struck a chord. "And the planet," the Lithivore representative rumbled, "you burned a biosphere." "To save the system," Stukov said. The spore density was critical. If we had landed troops, the infection would have latched onto our dropships, our armor. We would have spread it to the next system and the next. We cauterized the wound. It is ugly. It is painful, but the patient lives. He gestured to the main screen where the Ethelgard suns were shining on a clear space, void of the red menace. You are alive. Your families on this station are alive. Your homeworlds are safe. You are welcome. Why? Gorth stepped forward, moving down from the alcove. The massive Kragari warrior looked the human in the eye. Why did you come? We imprisoned you. We shunned you. We treated you like rabid animals. Why spend your ammunition, your fuel, to save a galaxy that despises you? Stukov looked at Gorth, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened just a fraction. Because we remember, Stukov said. We remember what it is like to be alone in the dark. We remember when our own world tried to kill us every day of our evolution. We remember looking up at the stars and hoping someone was out there. He reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a small data chip. He placed it on the railing. And because, Stukov continued, his voice lowering, becoming graver, we know what the scourge is. You call it the Crimson Scourge. You think it is a random mutation, a biological accident. It is not, Valen asked, the fear returning. No, Stukov said. It is a weapon, a biological probe. The silence in the room became absolute, a vacuum of sound. A probe, Valen whispered. We found the records on Mars, in the ruins of a civilization that died 1 billion years before we crawled out of the ocean, Stukov explained. The Scourge is a precursor. It is sent ahead to soften the galaxy, to consume biomass, to clear resistance, to prepare the way. For what? The Hydrari bubbled, terror vibrating in the water. For the harvesters, Stukov said. The ones who built it, they are coming. They are out in the deep void, moving between galaxies. The Scourge was their scout. And you, he looked around the room, you were failing the test. Stukov began to pace, his boots loud in the quiet hall. You built a garden. You built a civilization of art and philosophy and soft light. That is beautiful, truly. But gardens do not survive the winter unless someone builds a wall, unless someone stands at the gate with a torch. You are that wall, Gorth asked. We are the fire, Stukov said. We are the species that evolved to fight. We are the ones who cracked the atom before we cured the common cold. We are the ones who weaponized our own environment. You locked us away because you feared us. You were right to fear us, but you were wrong to think you didn't need us. He pointed to the screen, to the drifting debris of the Scourge fleet. This was a skirmish, a patrol. The real war is coming, and you are not ready. You have forgotten how to bleed. You have forgotten that the universe is not benevolent. It is indifferent, and it is hungry. Valen looked at the human. He saw the scars, the harshness, the lack of elegance. He saw a creature that had been forged in fire, shaped by conflict. And he realized with a sudden, vertigo-inducing clarity that the Concordat had been children playing in a sandbox, while the humans had been guarding the perimeter against wolves they refused to acknowledge. What happens now? Valen asked. Do you conquer us? Do you demand tribute? Stukov laughed, a short, dry bark of a sound. Conquer you? We have enough trouble managing our own system. We don't want your worlds. We don't want your trade routes. We want you to survive. He tapped the data chip he had placed on the railing. That chip contains the schematics for the weapons we use today. Shield frequencies, kinetic drivers, radiological scrubbers. It contains the location of the Mars archives. It contains our tactical assessments of the coming threat. You are sharing your technology, the Lithivore asked, stunned. The technology we banned. We are arming you, Stukov said. Because when the harvesters arrive, we cannot fight them alone. We are strong, yes. We are vicious. But we are few. We need the Concordat's industrial capacity. We need your scientific minds. We need your logistics. Stukov turned back to the airlock, his guard forming up around him. We responded to your SOS, Stukov said, looking back over his shoulder. We brought fire because fire was what was needed. Next time we hope to bring something else, but that depends on you. Wait, Valen called out. Where are you going? Back to the exclusion zone, Stukov said. We have to reload, and we have to wake the rest of the fleet, the sleepers, the colony ships. We have been preparing for the harvesters for 300 years. We are moving to the galactic rim, to the ingress points. We will hold the line. You will die, Gorth said, if this enemy is as great as you say. Stukov smiled, a grim, wolfish baring of teeth. We are Deathworlders, General. We were born dying. We just make sure we take the enemy with us. But we judged you, Valen said, his voice trembling with a mix of shame and gratitude. We called you monsters. Stukov paused. The helmeted soldiers around him shifted, their posture alert but disciplined. You called us monsters, Stukov agreed softly. And you were right. But sometimes, High Counselor, you need a monster to kill the nightmare. Do not make us come back for the wrong reasons. With that, the humans turned and marched out. The airlock hissed shut. The heavy thud of their boots faded, leaving the grand chamber in a silence that was different from before. It was no longer the silence of despair. It was the silence of a wake-up call. Valen looked at the data chip. It sat there, a small piece of plastic and silicon that contained the power of a Deathworld. He looked at Gorth. They saved us, the Airy Lord whispered, with fire. No, Gorth said, walking up to the podium and placing his large hand over the chip. Not fire, mercy. They gave us the mercy of a second chance. Gorth looked at Valen. We have work to do, High Counselor. The garden is closed. It is time to fortify the walls. Valen nodded slowly. He looked up at the screen, where the Indomitable and its escort were turning away, their massive engines lighting up the dark as they prepared to jump back into the void. They looked ugly, brutal, and terrifying. They looked like the most beautiful things he had ever seen. Activate the industrial fabricators, Valen ordered, his voice finding a new strength, a steel that hadn't been there before. Call the fleets, lift the embargo on Saul, and send a message to the Terran High Command. What message? The communications officer asked. 2 words, Valen said, watching the human ships vanish into the Terran space. Thank you. The transition following the departure of the Terran fleet was not one of celebration, but of a frantic, paradigm-shifting mobilization. The Grand Conclave, once a hall of debate and slow deliberation, transformed into a war room. The data Stukov had left behind was not just weapon schematics. It was a cosmological map of horror. It showed the patterns of dead galaxies, the migration routes of the harvesters, the mathematical certainty of their arrival. Deep in the lower levels of the station, where the science guilds operated, the analysis of the Shiva protocol was underway. Head scientist Zalona, a slender, multi-limbed insectoid, stared at the readings from the battle. She was trembling. High Counselor, she said as Valen entered the lab, you must see this. Is it the weapon yields? Valen asked. We know they used fusion devices. It is not the weapons, Zalona chirped, her antennae twitching in agitation. It is the precision. I have reconstructed the firing solutions of the Terran fleet. Look. She brought up a holographic model of the Scourge fleet as it had been. Here is the bioship Alpha, here is the Terran railgun shot, and here, she zoomed in to a microscopic level. Here is the trajectory. It went through the center mass, Valen observed. It went through the neural cluster, Zalona corrected. The brain, and look at the fallout, the radiation dispersal. It was timed to decay within hours. The heat bloom was shaped to avoid the atmosphere of Ethelgard as much as possible until the final planetary strike. Even the planetary strike. They hit the tectonic fault lines to trigger a crust collapse to bury the biomass, rather than just burning the surface. It was calculated. Every joule of energy was calculated. Valen stared at the data. They made it look like brute force. It was surgical butchery, Zalona said. They are not savages, Counselor. They are mathematicians of death, the level of processing power required to coordinate that fleet volley. Their combat AI is generations ahead of ours. We thought they were brute thugs hitting things with rocks. In reality, they are snipers using asteroids. And the biology? Valen asked. Stukov said the victims were already dead. We analyzed the debris, Zalona said quietly. He was right, the DNA of the crew, it was shattered. The Scourge writes a retrovirus into the host that dissolves the frontal cortex within minutes of infection. The people on those ships, they were gone before the distress call even reached us. The humans knew, their sens. Ors can read biological states through hull plating. They didn't fire until they were sure. Valen felt a wave of nausea, followed by a profound sense of shame. They knew, and they knew we wouldn't believe them, so they didn't argue, they just acted. They took the burden of the sin onto themselves, Gorth said, stepping from the shadows of the lab entrance. That is the concept of command in their culture, to make the hard choice so others don't have to. Gorth walked over to the display. We have begun retrofitting the Kragari fleets with the railgun designs. It is difficult. Our ships are built for elegance, for sustainability. These weapons tear the frames apart with their recoil. We have to reinforce the keels with hyperdense alloys. Do it, Valen said, whatever the cost. There is something else, Gorth said, his voice low. A transmission from the outer rim, from the edge of the exclusion zone. The humans. No, Gorth said, something that was following them. The scene shifts to the bridge of the Void Stalker, a Kragari stealth corvette patrolling the edge of the Sol exclusion zone. Captain Rourke gripped the railing. Repeat that sensor, Ghost. It's gone, Captain, the sensor operator reported. But for a second, it looked like a shadow, not a ship, a shadow in the background radiation. Did it match the Scourge profile? No, sir, it was cold, absolute zero, and it was massive, larger than the Terran dreadnought. Rourke looked out into the blackness. The Terran fleet had returned to Sol, vanishing behind their blockade buoys, but the door they had opened, it felt like a draft was coming through. Stukov spoke of harvesters, Rourke muttered. Gods, if the Scourge was the scout. Suddenly the comms panel lit up. Priority signal from the Terran sector, they are hailing us. Put it through. The screen flickered, revealing the face not of Stukov, but of a younger human female wearing a headset and looking exhausted. Behind her, Rourke could see a hive of activity. A massive control center, humans running back and forth, tactical maps glowing red. This is Terra Control, the woman said, her voice fast, clipped. To the Kragari vessel on our perimeter, you are being tracked. Tracked, Rourke bristled. By whom? By the hunter-killer, the woman said. It followed our wake back from Ethelgard. It's cloaked. Listen to me very carefully. You need to drop your shields. Drop my shields, Rourke roared. Are you insane? The hunter-killer tracks shield harmonics, the woman shouted. It hunts energy signatures. Drop your shields and go to silent running, or you will be dead in 10 seconds. Rourke looked at her eyes. There was no deception there, only terror and professional urgency. Cut power, Rourke bellowed. Emergency shutdown, all systems, drop shields. The crew hesitated for a fraction of a second, then obeyed. The Void Stalker plunged into darkness. The hum of the reactor died. The gravity plating faded, leaving them floating in zero-G. The air grew instantly stale. They drifted in the dark. Then they saw it. It passed less than a kilometer from their hull. It was not a ship of metal. It was a slit in the universe, a V-shaped void that distorted the stars behind it. It made no sound, emitted no heat. It was a predator of pure entropy. As it passed, the hull of the Void Stalker groaned, the metals stressing under the gravitational wake of the thing. It moved past them toward the Sol system, toward the blockade. It's going for Earth, Rourke whispered in the dark. The console flickered to life on battery power. The human woman was back, her image ghostly in the low-power mode. Good reaction, Captain, she whispered. Now listen, we are going to engage it. Do not interfere. You are about to see why we never leave our system. What is that thing? Rourke asked. A harvester vanguard, she said. It's here to test our defenses. Watch. The view on the passive sensors showed the shadow ship approaching the Sol defense grid. The blockade buoys, which the Concordat had always assumed were there to keep humans in, suddenly pivoted. They didn't point inward. They pointed outward. Mines the size of cities activated. Latticeworks of laser satellites powered up, drawing energy directly from the sun. The entire Sol system lit up like a Christmas tree. It was a fortress. The humans hadn't been rotting in prison. They had been building a bunker. The harvester ship accelerated, sensing the trap. It fired a beam of dark energy that collapsed the space in front of it, acting as a shield. Then the Earth moved. Or rather, the moon moved. On the sensors, the lunar surface shifted. Huge sections of regolith retracted. The dark side of the moon wasn't rock, it was a cannon, an orbital accelerator of planetary scale. Fire, the command came over the link. The moon fired. It was a beam of antimatter, magnetically containment beamed. It struck the harvester ship. The collision was blinding. For a second, there was a second sun in the sky. When the light faded, the harvester ship was gone, not destroyed, erased. Rourke stared at the screen. The Kragari crew floated in silence. Target neutralized, the human woman said, her voice shaking slightly. Terra Control to Kragari vessel. You are clear to power up. And Captain. Yes, Rourke managed to say. Tell the Council, she said. Tell them the war has started, and tell them the Deathworlders are holding the door. The transmission ended. High Counselor Valen stood in the observation deck of the Ethelgard station, looking at the stars. The report from Captain Rourg had been verified. The footage of the moon weapon had been circulated to the highest levels of the Concordat military. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. The universe was a dark forest, filled with horrors. The Concordat had built a clearing and pretended the trees didn't exist. They had mocked the wolves that guarded the edge of the light. But now, the wolves were the only thing standing between the clearing and the dark. Valen turned to the assembly. The mood had changed. The Hydrari were designing coolant systems for railguns. The Lithivores were synthesizing armor plating based on Terran specs. The Airy Lords were training for high-G maneuvers. "We responded to their SOS," Valen whispered to himself, correcting the narrative in his head. "No, they answered ours before we even sent it." He keyed the comms to the fleet. "This is High Counselor Valen. All fleets set coordinates for the Sol system. We are not going to blockade them. We are going to reinforce them. The humans have fought alone for long enough." He looked at the tactical map, where the red warning lights of the harvesters were beginning to blink on the edge of the galaxy. "Let them come," Valen said, his voice echoing the calm, terrifying resolve of Stukov. "We have fire, too." The camera pans out from the station, zooming back through the crystalline structures past the rebuilding fleets, past the stars, drifting through the silence of space until it reaches the Sol system. There, amidst the debris of the Harvester Scout and the glowing fortifications of humanity, a single buoy blinks. It transmits a signal, not of distress but of defiance. A loop broadcasting into the dark void where the ancient enemies wait. "This is Sol, we are still here. Come and try."